Director Brennan, it's very good to see you. Let's talk about why the PDB is so important, what Joe Biden is going to get access to now, finally, weeks after he was declared the winner.
Well, Andrea, that President's Daily Brief contains all of the important information that a president, vice president, and senior members of a national security team need in order to ensure that they do their utmost to protect U.S. national security interests. So I'm hoping that Joe Biden is going to receive the exact same PDB that's been delivered to the White House, hand-delivered, during this administration. Now, it certainly is going to look different than it did during the Obama administration because it's usually tailored in terms of its format to cater to the interests of the incumbent in the Oval Office. But it's critically important that Joe Biden have the ability in advance, 2 months in advance, so that he understands exactly the dynamics that are at play on the full range of issues that a president of the United States needs to deal with, including on day one of his presidency.
And he can ask questions or ask to look at backup material, can he not? Because we know President Trump rarely gets the intelligence briefing in the first place, does not read very much. But even if it is bare bones and highly visual, pictorial for his benefit, Joe Biden can ask questions of his briefers.
Well, absolutely. I think Donald Trump does not meet with an intelligence briefer. Joe Biden will, I think, insist that an intelligence briefer be there so that President-elect Biden can ask questions, he can make comments, he can seek clarification from the briefer. So I do think it's going to be an interactive session that he's going to be having with the briefers, and to ensure that he has full grasp, again, of these issues that range from terrorist threats to relations between the United States, China, Russia, and the full range of other proliferation and other geostrategic issues.
Now, you called the assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist highly reckless. Tell us what your concerns are about whoever did it. And let's just say Iran is pointing to Israel, and Israel has done operations like this before.
Well, Andrea, I don't know who actually carried out that attack or authorized it, but I have two main concerns. One is if a country had authorized or conducted that attack, I think it is beyond the norms in terms of the practices that states should engage in terms of assassinating the senior officials of other governments. Israel and Iran are not in a state of war. And so just the way we would condemn vigorously any type of assassination carried out by Russia, China, or any other country, we should do it when there is a senior government official of a sovereign state who's assassinated. Secondly, though, as we're going through this very, very important transition from one administration to the other, we want to make sure that there's not going to be some type of escalation of tensions in the Middle East that could lead to some type of confrontation. Now, clearly, the Trump administration has a much different approach to Iran than does the Biden administration. But in the waning days of the Trump administration, for them to do something that could provoke an Iranian retaliatory strike that, again, could lead then to a sharp escalation of tensions, we don't know where that might wind up. So I think it should be in the best interest of this country for there not to be any provocations. And again, I don't know who conducted it or whether or not the United States was consulted. I just think that at this time, we really should try to tone down the tensions as opposed to try to escalate them.
You know, we don't know who did it, but we do know that Mike Pompeo, Bibi Netanyahu, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, were together in the kingdom just a week before this operation took place. I would speculate, I don't know what you would, that it's highly unlikely that this would not have been discussed or some aspect of it. How common would it be for Israel to pull something off without at least notifying the U.S.?
Well, I'm glad that Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United States are having a dialogue, even if it is being done in secret. I think that's important to have that type of interaction. The United States and Israel have very close relations with one another, including on the intelligence and security front. If Israel conducted any type of assassinations during the Obama administration, we would have raised immediately our objections and concerns about it. And so I don't know what had transpired in terms of what might have been shared between Secretary Pompeo, MBS, and Netanyahu. But the timing of this may be just coincidental, but also I think it is concerning in terms of what might have been discussed or shared with U.S. tolerance.
And certainly the Iranians are looking at that as well. Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, told Chuck Todd yesterday that he's concerned about some of these Trump loyalists at the Pentagon and what they may do in the next 49 or 50 days.
Well, I think we all should be concerned about it because I think Mark Esper was really standing strong against Trump's efforts to do certain types of things. And so I do not believe that the current senior leadership of the Pentagon has the same spine and willingness to speak out and push back against some of these activities. So over the next number of weeks that Trump remains in the White House, I don't know what he might have planned in terms of using the U.S. military, either on the domestic front or in the international arena. But I do think Trump has demonstrated a tendency to be impulsive and not to take the best interests of the country at heart, but only see what is in his best interests as he continues to, I think, be a lame duck during these last 2 months.
John Brennan, former CIA director, thank you so much, as always.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.